March 8, 1999. 4:47 p.m. Mountain Time, 8,000 feet above the Teton Range, Wyoming. Harrison Ford is alone in the cockpit of his vintage, 1929 Waco Taperwing when he hears the sound that every pilot dreads: complete engine silence. The propeller stops spinning, the nose drops, and in that moment of terrifying quiet, Harrison Ford realizes he has less than 2 minutes to live. What happens in the next 90 seconds won't just test every flying skill Harrison has learned in 20 years of aviation. It will reveal who Harrison Ford really is when everything he loves hangs in the balance: his life, his family, his legacy. And for the next 72 hours, while Hollywood goes about its business, nobody will know that one of its biggest stars just survived the impossible. To understand how Harrison Ford ended up fighting for his life above the Wyoming wilderness, you need to know what brought him there on that cold March afternoon. It wasn't a movie role or a publicity event. It was something much more personal and much more dangerous. Harrison had been struggling with what his friends quietly called the darkness. After decades of playing heroes on screen, he was questioning whether he had become anything heroic in real life. At 56, he felt trapped by his own success, suffocated by the expectations of a world that saw him as Indiana Jones and Han Solo, but never as just Harrison. The flying had become his escape. In the cockpit of a plane, thousands of feet above the world's problems, Harrison found the only piece he could trust. The vintage Waco Taperwing he was flying that day was his favorite, a 1929 biplane that required real skill to handle, with none of the modern safety features that might save you if something went wrong. Harrison loved that plane because it was honest, recalls his longtime mechanic, Jack Morrison. It would kill you if you made a mistake, but it would also show you things about yourself that you couldn't learn any other way. That day it taught him something about death that changed his life forever. The flight had started routinely. Harrison took off from Jackson Hole Airport at 3:30 p.m., planning a solo scenic tour of the Teton Range. The weather was perfect: clear skies, unlimited visibility, light winds, everything a pilot could ask for. He climbed to 8,000 feet and settled into the peaceful rhythm of flight that had become his meditation, his therapy, his refuge from a world that never stopped watching. What Harrison didn't know was that a tiny metal fatigue crack in his engine's oil line had been growing for weeks. With each flight, each vibration, each landing, that crack had spread microscopic fractions of an inch. By March 8th, it was ready to fail catastrophically. At 4:47 p.m., flying over a particularly remote section of the Teton wilderness, the oil line finally ruptured. Within seconds, Harrison's engine was starved of lubrication. The pistons seized, the propeller stopped, and suddenly Harrison Ford wasn't flying anymore. He was falling. The silence was deafening. For a man who had spent thousands of hours listening to the steady rhythm of aircraft engines, the sudden quiet felt like death itself. Harrison looked at his altimeter: 8,000 feet. He looked at his airspeed dropping fast. He looked out the window. Nothing but snow-covered mountains and forest as far as he could see. Most pilots in that situation would panic. Some would freeze. Harrison Ford did something different. He did what he had trained himself to do in 20 years of flying, what had kept him alive through countless movie stunts, what had carried him through every crisis of his life. He got to work. "Okay," Harrison said aloud to himself, his voice calm in the suddenly quiet cockpit. He had maybe 90 seconds before impact. At his current rate of descent, he would hit the mountains at roughly 120 miles per hour. Nobody survives that. But Harrison wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about the problem in front of him and how to solve it. First priority: find somewhere to land. Harrison scanned the terrain below, looking for anything flat enough and long enough to accommodate a powerless airplane. What he saw wasn't encouraging. The Teton Wilderness is some of the most rugged country in North America: jagged peaks, dense forest, steep valleys, and very few open spaces. But Harrison had one advantage that most pilots don't. He knew this country intimately. He had been flying over these mountains for years, studying every ridge, every valley, every meadow, and suddenly, he remembered something. About 3 miles northeast of his position, there was a narrow alpine meadow that he had noticed on previous flights. It wasn't long enough for a normal landing, and it was surrounded by trees on 3 sides, but it was the only flat ground within gliding distance. If he could reach it, if he could get the approach angle exactly right, if he could somehow stop the plane before hitting the trees, he might live. The margin for error was 0. Miss the meadow by 50 feet in any direction, and he would die instantly. Come in too steep, and he would crash before reaching the ground. Come in too shallow, and he would hit the trees at the far end. There was exactly one way to do it right, and Harrison Ford had never attempted anything like it before. At 6,000 feet, Harrison began his approach. He had no engine power, so he couldn't adjust his descent rate with throttle. He had only the aircraft's natural gliding characteristics and his own skill to work with. It was like threading a needle while falling off a cliff. Harrison slipped the Waco into a forward slip, a technique that increases drag and steepens the descent angle without increasing airspeed. It's a dangerous maneuver under perfect conditions. In a powerless airplane approaching a postage stamp meadow surrounded by mountains, it was borderline suicidal. At 4,000 feet, the meadow came into view. It was smaller than Harrison remembered. Much smaller. Maybe 800 feet long and 200 feet wide, with a slight uphill slope and trees pressing in on all sides. Landing a vintage biplane in that space would challenge the best pilots in the world. Doing it without power seemed impossible. At 2,000 feet, Harrison could see individual trees, rocks, even animal tracks in the snow. The meadow was coming up fast. Too fast. He was high and hot, carrying too much altitude and too much airspeed for the short field he was trying to reach. In a few seconds, he would either have to commit to the landing or accept that he was going to die in the next 30 seconds. That's when Harrison Ford made the decision that saved his life. Instead of trying to force the landing, Harrison chose to go around, except he couldn't go around because he had no power. What he could do was extend his approach, bleeding off altitude and airspeed by flying a precise pattern that would bring him to the meadow at exactly the right height and speed, or not at all. It was a gamble that most pilots wouldn't take. If Harrison misjudged the approach by even a few feet, he would hit the mountainside short of the meadow. But if he tried to force the original approach, he would certainly overshoot and crash into the trees. Sometimes, the longest shot is the only shot. Harrison flew a perfect approach pattern, using every technique he had learned in 2 decades of flying. He slipped and skidded the airplane through the mountain air, trading altitude for position, speed for precision, hope for certainty. And with 500 feet left between him and death, the numbers finally started to work. The Waco crossed the threshold of the meadow at exactly 65 miles per hour, just above stall speed, but slow enough to stop in the available distance. Harrison held the airplane off the ground for as long as possible, bleeding off every bit of excess speed before gently setting it down on the frozen earth. The landing roll lasted exactly 450 feet. Harrison had 350 feet left before the trees. It was the most precise flying of his life, accomplished under the worst possible conditions, with stakes higher than any movie stunt he had ever attempted. As the Waco rolled to a stop in the Wyoming snow, Harrison Ford sat in the cockpit for a long moment, his hands shaking on the controls. He was alive. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectation, he was alive. But he was also stranded in one of the most remote places in North America, with night falling and the temperature dropping below 0. Harrison climbed out of the airplane and assessed his situation. He was unhurt, not even a bruise. The Waco had suffered some damage to the landing gear and propeller, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. More importantly, he had a survival kit in the back of the plane: emergency food, water, a sleeping bag, and a portable radio. But when Harrison tried the radio, he discovered the problem that would turn his close call into a 72-hour ordeal. The crash had damaged the antenna, and he was too deep in the mountains to reach anyone anyway. He was completely cut off from the outside world, with no way to tell anyone where he was or that he was even alive. As darkness fell over the Teton wilderness, Harrison Ford faced a choice that would define the rest of the story. He could try to hike out, a dangerous proposition in the dark over unfamiliar terrain. He could stay with the airplane and hope someone would find him, though he hadn't filed a flight plan and nobody knew exactly where to look. Or he could do something that went against every pilot's instinct. He could try to fix the plane himself and fly it out. Harrison chose the third option. Working by flashlight, in freezing temperatures, Harrison spent the night diagnosing the engine failure. What he found was both good news and bad news. The oil line rupture was catastrophic, but it was also repairable if he could jury-rig a replacement line from materials he had on hand, using wire from the radio antenna, rubber tubing from the survival kit, and clamps improvised from aluminum strips. Harrison Ford spent 12 hours building a temporary oil line. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't permanent, but it might hold long enough to get the engine running again. By dawn on March 9th, Harrison had repaired the oil line, serviced the engine with the small supply of spare oil he carried, and hand-propped the propeller until the engine coughed to life. The sound of that engine starting was the sweetest music Harrison had ever heard, but his ordeal wasn't over. The meadow that had seemed impossibly small when he was landing in it looked even smaller now that he had to take off from it. With trees on three sides and a slight uphill slope, Harrison would need every foot of available distance and every bit of the Waco's performance to get airborne. Harrison taxied the biplane to the very edge of the meadow, positioning it for the longest possible takeoff run. He performed a careful engine run-up, checking that his makeshift oil line was holding and that the engine was developing full power. Everything looked good, but looks can be deceiving when you're trying to fly an airplane out of a space that's barely large enough to land in. Harrison released the brakes and pushed the throttle forward. The Waco accelerated slowly on the rough, snow-covered ground. 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet, Harrison was running out of room fast. At 300 feet, the trees at the far end of the meadow seemed to be rushing toward him. At 400 feet, he was committed too fast to stop, not fast enough to fly. At 450 feet, with the trees looming directly ahead, Harrison pulled back on the stick. The Waco lifted off the ground just as its wheels cleared the uppermost branches. Harrison had made it by less than 10 feet, the margin between life and death, between freedom and disaster. The flight back to Jackson Hole Airport took 45 minutes. Harrison flew low and slow, nursing the engine and praying that his temporary oil line would hold. When he finally touched down on the familiar runway, he felt a sense of relief deeper than any emotion he had ever experienced. He wasn't just glad to be alive, he was grateful for every moment he had been given. Harrison Ford parked the Waco in its usual hangar, cleaned up the evidence of his wilderness repair work, and walked to his truck as if nothing had happened. The entire ordeal, from engine failure to successful return, had lasted less than 18 hours. But it had changed Harrison Ford in ways that would last the rest of his life. The first person Harrison called wasn't his publicist or his agent or even his wife. It was Jack Morrison, his mechanic. "Jack," Harrison said, "I need you to come take a look at the oil line on the Waco." And Jack? This conversation never happened. Jack arrived at the hangar 20 minutes later. What he found shocked him: evidence of an engine failure that should have killed Harrison Ford, and repairs that revealed both the desperation of the situation and the ingenuity of the pilot who had survived it. "Harrison," Jack said after examining the airplane, "do you realize how close you came to dying yesterday?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Jack Morrison has never forgotten: "Close enough to learn something I needed to know." For the next 72 hours, Harrison Ford went about his normal life. He attended meetings, read scripts, had dinner with friends, and never mentioned that he had nearly died alone in the Wyoming wilderness. But people who knew him well noticed something different. He was calmer, more present, less driven by the anxieties that had been consuming him. Something changed in Harrison after that weekend, recalls his longtime friend and flying companion Stuart Millar. "He never told me what happened, but I could see it in his eyes. He had the look of someone who had seen the other side and come back with a message." The closest Harrison ever came to talking about that night was 3 months later, during a casual conversation with director Steven Spielberg. They were discussing the risks that actors take in pursuit of authentic performances. When Harrison said something that stopped Spielberg cold, "Steven," Harrison said, "I've learned that the most important performances happen when nobody's watching. When it's just you and the thing you're most afraid of. That's when you find out who you really are." Spielberg later said he had no idea what Harrison was talking about, but he never forgot the intensity in his friend's voice when he said it. The mechanical investigation of Harrison's engine failure revealed just how close he had come to disaster. The oil line had ruptured completely, and the engine had run for less than 30 seconds before seizing. In those 30 seconds, Harrison had descended from 8,000 feet to 6,500 feet before beginning his approach to the meadow. If that failure had happened anywhere else, over a city, over water, over terrain without that meadow, Harrison would have died. Jack Morrison later explained, "The fact that it happened at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right pilot at the controls, that's not luck. That's something else." But perhaps the most remarkable part of Harrison Ford's near-death experience wasn't the emergency landing or the wilderness repair or the impossible takeoff. It was what he did with the knowledge that he had been given a second chance. In the months following the crash, Harrison quietly began changing how he approached both his career and his personal life. He became more selective about the roles he chose, focusing on characters and stories that meant something to him personally. He spent more time with his family, less time worrying about his public image. Most significantly, he started taking flying lessons again, not to improve his technical skills, which were already excellent, but to better understand the psychological aspects of aviation. He wanted to know why he had remained calm in those crucial 90 seconds, why he had made the right decisions under ultimate pressure. "That night taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear," Harrison later told a close friend. "Courage is being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. And sometimes the right thing is something you've never done before, something you're not sure you can do, but something you have to try because the alternative is unacceptable." The story of Harrison Ford's near-death experience remains secret for over 2 decades. Harrison never spoke about it publicly, never used it for publicity, never even told most of his family what had really happened during that weekend in Wyoming. But the experience became the foundation for how he approached the rest of his life. In 2015, when Harrison survived another plane crash, this one very public, landing on a golf course in Santa Monica, friends saw echoes of that earlier experience in how he handled the aftermath. The same calm, the same focus on what mattered, the same refusal to be defined by the accident. Harrison has a relationship with mortality that most people don't understand, observes Dr. Patricia Williams, an aviation psychologist who has worked with many pilots who have survived near-fatal accidents. He's looked death in the face multiple times, and instead of being traumatized by it, he's been educated by it. That's extremely rare. The vintage Waco Taperwing that carried Harrison through his wilderness ordeal was fully restored and returned to service. Harrison continued flying it for several more years, though he had the oil line system completely rebuilt with redundant safety features. He never again flew that particular route over the Teton Wilderness alone. But more importantly, Harrison never forgot the lesson of that March night in 1999. When life presented him with seemingly impossible choices in his career, in his relationships, in the daily challenges of being Harrison Ford, he remembered what it felt like to have 90 seconds to solve an unsolvable problem. And he remembered that sometimes the longest shot is the only shot worth taking. Today, when Harrison Ford talks about courage and authenticity and the importance of facing your fears, he speaks with the authority of someone who has been tested in ways that most people never will be. He knows what it feels like to stare death in the face and refuse to blink. He knows what it takes to bet everything on your own skill and judgment and come through when it matters most. The night Harrison Ford nearly died in the Wyoming wilderness was the night he truly learned to live. Not as a movie star, not as an icon, but as a human being who had discovered the most important thing anyone can know about themselves. That when everything is on the line, when the stakes are ultimate and the margin for error is zero, you can count on yourself to do what needs to be done. That knowledge, earned in the loneliest and most dangerous 90 seconds of his life, became the foundation for everything Harrison Ford accomplished in the years that followed. And although the world never knew how close it came to losing one of its greatest stars on that March night in 1999, Harrison Ford knew, and that knowledge changed everything. The secret of the Wyoming wilderness wasn't just about surviving an airplane crash. It was about discovering that the same qualities that made Harrison Ford a legendary actor, courage, determination, grace under pressure, were real, not just characters he played on screen. When the cameras weren't rolling and nobody was watching, when it was just him and the mountains and the possibility of death, Harrison Ford proved to himself that the hero was real. And sometimes, that's the most important audience of all.